One, two, three. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me this morning as we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're finally getting back to 1 Corinthians, and so I know it's been a hot minute, but we will dive back in. Remember, we're asking questions about the church, about Christian life, and how the book of Corinthians informs us about these things. So I'm going to go ahead and throw chapter 11 up. Now, chapter 11 is an unusual passage. It's one of, that light was bright. It's one of my favorite passages, and I have some sentimental attachment to this passage. This was actually in seminary. Without knowing it, Kristen and I wrote the same paper. We wrote a paper on this passage. We came to the same conclusions independent of one another. We were dating at the time, so I don't know if that says something about our dating communication. That's a joke. But I really enjoy this passage. We're going to be talking about hair and prophecy, men and women. Now, in the Bible, there's some things that are eternal in nature, right? They're lasting in nature. So for instance, salvation through Christ alone. That is unchanging. That is not bound by context. That's a universal truth. There are other things, though, that are highly bound by their context, right? When we read the law, the context of the law as it relates to Christ, as well as we don't necessarily follow certain laws. I doubt that you have holes dug in certain spots in your yard where a ox could not walk into it, right? So there's times when reading the Bible where if context governs the situation, we look for the universal truth within that context. This is not always the case, but there are times. I believe this passage perhaps has one of these. So let me read the passage as the whole. We're going to do 2 through 16. Remember, verse 1 we included with last week, which was imitate me as I imitate Christ. So I'm going to go ahead and read the passage as a whole. Then we're going to buzz through it real quick. This is a long passage, so we're going to try to clip right along. Verse 2. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold fast to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. Every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Since that is one and the same as having her head shaved off, or as having her head shaved. For if a woman doesn't cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her head be covered. A man should not cover his head because he is the image and glory of God. So too, woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman came from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. This is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and nor is man independent of woman. For just as a woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature teach us that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is to her glory? For her hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. So this is an interesting passage. It's an unusual passage. I'm going to give you my interpretation. There's a lot that we could cover, and I don't necessarily want this to be a 5-hour video. So there will be times where we'll skim past something, and it may not be as satisfactory, perhaps, as you're wanting or I'm wanting. But for the sake of brevity, we're going to keep it short. Some context. In Corinth and in other places in the ancient Near East, there was the custom that either women would have their heads covered or they would have long hair. For a woman to have either short hair or her head uncovered was oftentimes the mark of a prostitute. And for men, vice versa, long hair or a covered head could mean that, and with men it was typically just the hair, could mean that this was the mark of a prostitute. So men would have short hair because of that. This was a gender norm. And that's something that I want us to hone in on, is this idea of the role of genders. Pause. And this is something that I want us to hone in on, is the idea of gender and gender placement and gender role. Gender is something that is from the Lord, right? It is something, it's one of the base truths of our existence, right? Is that God created us and he created us male and female. So we're going to look a little bit at that. So this begins with, now I praise you, which is not a common phrase in Corinthians, right? Is now I praise you. Why? Because you remember me in everything and hold fast to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. I like this word, hold fast, right? We hold fast to the teachings, right? And so verse 3, but I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of every woman, and God is the head of Christ. There's this authority structure innate to what God has created. There's a positioning. You'll oftentimes hear it discussed like this. Men and women are equal in value, but different in role. And we see that with God and Christ, right? That God and Christ are equal in value, but they do different things. They serve a different role. The Son obeys the Father. The Spirit obeys the Son and the Father. We have this authority structure that is seen in the Trinity that is also seen in our world. You actually see this with Genesis as well. Mankind rules over the animals, right? So there's authority structures set up throughout. This authority structure does not say that they're not valuable. It just says what the authority structure is. So here we see this reflection of that authority structure, and then it bleeds into verse 4. Every man who prays with something on his head dishonors it, and every woman who prays or prophesies with their head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved off. By the way, if you see some letters and whatnot, I missed a couple while copying the text over for you. For if a woman doesn't cover her head, she should have her head shaved off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to cut her hair off or her head to be shaved, let her head be covered. There were these customs that they're dealing with, right? They're dealing with how to pray and when to pray. Now, I don't think that the actual hair, no hair, is the universal principle. I mean, just in a laughing way, right? I used to have very long hair. My hair was below my shoulders, and I kept it that way a long time and would donate it and do different things like that. I don't think this passage is discussing actual hair length. Just like for many of the women in our church, they have very short hair. I don't think the universal truth here is that. I think the universal truth is actually this idea of honoring the distinction between the genders. And in every culture, that looks a little bit different. For instance, in Israelite culture, the rabbis would wear a head dressing while they prayed. So I don't think that this is actually talking about the head dressing, the hair length, all that. I don't think that's the core issue. I think we're missing the point when we hone in on that. I think what the point is that we should honor the distinction between our genders. Perhaps in our culture, the better distinction would be something like a dress, right? That women, gender-wise, wear a dress, men do not wear a dress. Or looking in the home of what a father does and what a mother does. I think it's important to identify, I am Charlie's father, and Kristen is Charlie's mother, right? That we can't switch roles. That's who we are. And so we honor the gender which God has given us because it reflects what's going on in the Trinity. Verse 7 kind of continues this thought of no man should cover his head because he is the image and glory of God. And I just want to take a moment here and say that women are also made in the image of God. In the image of God, God created them, male and female. What Paul is showing here, though, he's highlighting the authority structure, right? He's trying to highlight the fact that man is to reflect Christ, woman is to honor, right? That we're supposed to honor the setup of this complementary authority structure. This is not saying women are not in the image of God. What it's saying, though, is that while we have the same value, there is a different role, and we should honor that. Neither was man created for man came from woman, but woman, or man did not come from woman, but woman came from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. This is why a woman should let there be an authority structure or a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. It's a very confusing statement. There's a lot of different ways that is taken. Following the God-Christ example is the angels are subservient to Christ. So there seems to be, just like in the Trinity, you have the Father, the Son, the angels. You also seem to have Christ, man, woman in the authority structure. Again, not value, authority chain. But there's a lot of ways that's taken. Verse 11, in the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as a woman came from man, so a man comes through a woman, and all things come from God. So it ultimately sets God again at the head of the authority, but it also reminds us this is where we get that equal value thing, right? Man was not created so woman would bow to man, and man was not created, or woman was not made so man would bow to woman. We were made to be mutual beneficiaries with an authority structure. Just as we see in the Trinity, Christ and God have the same value, even though they serve in a different role or capacity and authority. Then finally, we have judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray with her head uncovered? By the way, along the way, the words head and covered and all of these, there's a lot of ways these words are interpreted and translated. I tend to take uncovered to refer to both the head covering or having hair, period. Verse 14, does not even nature itself teach us that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, and that if a woman has long hair, it is to her glory? This word, and then we have, for her hair is given to her as a covering. This word nature, it's not necessarily referring, this is my interpretation, it's not necessarily referring to a universal nature, but it's referring to the fact that there are these distinct genders, right? We see this all through all of nature, is that there is a distinction between the two genders, and there are markers that make them different. In their context, it was hair length. If anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. And honing in on this universal truth of there are two distinct genders who sit complementary to one another in different roles, I want to highlight that there is no other teaching for the church. The church cannot have multiple genders other than two, right? The church can't acknowledge things like that. Why? Because there is no other biblical truth than that. We cling to the biblical truth that there are two genders who are mutually beneficiary to one another, but serve different roles as we reflect the Trinity. So I know that this is a confusing passage. I tried to keep it as short as we can and as quick as we can, get you the universal truth from it. Next week's passage, we're moving on to Lord's Supper and some things like that, a little more familiar ground. But I hope that this video is beneficial to you. I pray for you often. I hope you're praying for one another, and I hope you have a great week.